tools that serve and empower people with disabilities, to advocating for legislation that advances equity for people with disabilities, to increasing understanding of inclusion and equity within our community. The JCRC is deeply committed to improving the day-to-day lives of people with disabilities and those who live with them and care for them. SEDIC DC, the JCRC strategic partner and co-host for today's program, safeguards the legal rights and financial health of low-income DC residents confronting abusive debt collection practices and other consumer-related issues. Through its 2-year-old disabilities community project, SEDIC DC provides legal services, education, and advocacy tailored to the particular needs of low-income disabled DC residents who face these challenges. I want to thank SEDIC DC for co-sponsoring this webinar, and also thank the JCRC staff for its hard work to ensure its success. I know how much work goes into putting on one of these programs. We're so honored to be joined today by one of the nation's great civil rights luminaries and a member of our own Jewish community, Judy Heumann. Judy's story starts in her native Brooklyn, where in 1949, she contracted polio and as a result began to use a wheelchair for mobility. At the age of 5, she was denied the right to attend school because she was considered a fire hazard. Her parents played a strong role in fighting for her life as her rights as a child. And as a young adult, Judy understood that discrimination was a continuing fact of life for the disabled and concluded that working in collaboration with other disabled people, she had to play an advocacy role and to point this out and effectuate change. Judy has traveled, she's used a motorized vehicle her whole life and has used it to travel everywhere. She's been to countries on every continent in urban and rural communities alike. And she served in the Clinton administration as the Department of Education's Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. And President Obama appointed her later to serve as the first special advisor for international disability rights at the US State Department. She also served as the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development, the first director for the DC Department on Disability Services, and as a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. Along the way, Judy has played a role in the development and implementation of the most seminal pieces of legislation impacting people with disabilities, including the IDEA, Section 1504, the Americans with Disability Act, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Judy's story was featured in the Academy Award nominated documentary, Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, which was produced by Barack and Michelle Obama's production company, and which won the Independent Spirit, Peabody, Sundance Film Festival, and International Documentary Association Awards for Best Documentary Feature. I think you may have already received notice that it's available to see on Netflix. Her 2020 memoir, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights advocate, was named a Publisher's Weekly Best Book of the Year for nonfiction. She has received numerous honorary degree doctorates and awards and is now the producer of the Human Perspective, a podcast and YouTube channel that aims to share the beauty of the disability community. I had the honor of working with Gila Franklin Siegel for a number of years. She is the Associate Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. Prior to joining the JCRC, Gila was the founding director of the Tikkun Alum Women's Foundation of Greater Washington, a Jewish grant-making organization focused on empowering women philanthropists and supporting social change for women and girls. She has over 20 years experience in Jewishly grounded public policy and community relations. Gila is the daughter of 2 cerebral palsy parents and has written extensively about her parents' disabilities and their family's unique experiences and challenges. Her columns on disability and on a range of other issues related to Jewish community relations have appeared in a range of publications, including the Washington Post, Forward, and JTA. She received her undergraduate and law degrees from New York University and practiced law at Crowell and Mooring, a firm here in Washington, D.C., prior to joining the nonprofit sector. Judy and Gila will begin a conversation and then take questions from the audience. If you have a question at any point, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. I'll now turn over the program to Judy and Gila and step out of the way.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I have to say I'm fangirling here a little bit. It is such an honor and a delight to be here with Judy Heumann, who was a constant revered name in my household when I was growing up. Every time you were appointed to a new high-level administration position, my parents, and particularly my dad, who knew you, was just full of pride and also full of hope, because he knew that you were working on the issues that impacted them on a daily basis. So I am thrilled to be here with you, and again, really honored.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's been an eventful couple of years for you, and everything from attending the Oscars when Crip Camp was nominated to your book. And I can say that even just in planning this webinar and scheduling it, so many people have written to me saying that they watched Crip Camp in preparation for this webinar. So just by us having this conversation, we've really encouraged more people to access the film. How do you feel the film and your book have impacted people's perceptions of people with disabilities, the constant quest for disability equity, and what, if anything, has surprised you the most about people's reactions to the movie and the book?
Thanks so much, Gila. Let me first say that there's a second book also. So for people who have kids or grandkids, it's called Rolling Warrior, and it's for a younger audience of readers, like 9-10 years old. And both of the books are on audio. So, and the audio was done by Ali Stryker, who is the first disabled wheelchair user to perform on Broadway, and got a Tony Award for her performance in Oklahoma. And then, of course, I'm just going to mention that last night, the SAG Awards, Coda received 2 really wonderful awards. And mentioning that is really, Gila, in part to talk about the progress that's being made. So I think we're a little bit further ahead now in the organizing that's been going on within the disability community. And I want to say that although I am not a big fan of months, the Jewish Disability Awareness and Inclusion Month, I think over the last number of years has been getting more attention within the Jewish community. And I believe it's also been, these discussions have been moving away from just looking at physical accessibility to looking at disability as a social justice issue. So I think the book, the books, the movie, and other work that's going on really is beginning to get more people to move away from looking at disability as a charity issue. Now, it isn't to say that ensuring that the Jewish Federation and others include disabled people in the work that they're doing, but I think there's a fundamental shift when you begin to look at disability as a civil rights issue, which clearly your father and mother understood, in part because, like me and hundreds of thousands of disabled people in the US and around the world, discrimination was something many years ago that people really didn't look at as discrimination. When my mom took me to school and the principal said I couldn't go because I was a fire hazard, and I only got 2.5 hours a week of education until the middle of the 4th grade, and then got sent to segregated classes only with disabled children, where I was the first child to go to a regular high school in those classes. At that point, particularly kids with cerebral palsy, were staying there till they were 21, and then they were being sent to sheltered workshops. So in some real way, your father and your mother were breaking the mold because, they were able to go to school, finish school, get college degrees, and move forward. So what do I see as some of what has surprised me? When Crip Camp came out, the film, and it was shown at Sundance, and I was lucky to be there with Jimmy LeBrecq and Nicole Newnham, who were the directors of the film. I must have gone to like 6 presentations, and there was a panel after each presentation, and thousands of people saw the film. And the most common comment people made was, how come we didn't know this story? So I think one of the important parts about the film, my book, and many other books is that people are looking and listening a little bit more and beginning to ask questions. Like, what role are we playing in discrimination? What should we be doing differently, both as individuals, as congregations, as employers, businesses, just general members of society? I think the discussion has ramped up a little bit. And I think that's all very important. And for me, it's also interesting that people are still watching the film. The other day, I was outside after services at Addis Israel. We went over to Yael's, and a woman came by who works on the house and said she had just seen the film and how important it was to her. So I think this, why didn't we know this story, is moving, as I was saying, more into not only why didn't I know this story, but what is it that I need to be doing in my day-to-day lives?
And one of the things that struck me the most about Crip Camp was that it portrayed the Janetians, those who worked and were campers at Camp Jened, which my parents talked about all the time, as complete people, as holistic people, not just, as you said, a charity case, not as just the disease or the condition or the disability. And I know from my own childhood, people would constantly ask me if I was adopted. Not that there would be anything wrong if I was adopted, but they could not believe that a cerebral
Your parents
palsy,
had sex.
you got it. And then they would be fascinated that even before that they even met each other. They would say, where did they meet? As if two disabled people couldn't possibly meet and fall in love and get married the way other people do. And it always frustrated me. And so one thing about Crip Camp is that it shows everybody in their fullness as human beings, as smoking weed, having boyfriends and girlfriends, just being normal people. And it seemed like the camp provided a place for them to bring their full selves in a way that regular society didn't. Can you talk a little bit about not just what that was like at that time, but also what work we have left to do in that regard, in terms of looking, how we look at people, how we speak about people who have disabilities. Just a few months ago, there was a headline in the Times of Israel that used the term wheelchair bound. And I couldn't believe it. And it was corrected within 8 hours, but it took hours and hours. So when you have a
And the good news is it got corrected.
Yes, exactly.
In many cases, it doesn't get corrected at all.
Right. And I was beside myself. So, where are we with those kind of fundamental issues about how people perceive people with disabilities in their fullness?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you may have already heard this, but I think most of you not. So in the 1970s, I didn't date a lot. I dated when I was at camp, but outside of camp, I didn't date a lot. And the dating services were coming into play. So I applied to one of them. And it was a terrible experience because there was nowhere on the form where you could say you had a disability. So you would get a call, and there was no way I couldn't tell somebody that I used a wheelchair. And so I did. And usually it went, that was the end of the discussion. But in the 1980s, I had moved from Berkeley in the from Brooklyn to Berkeley to go to graduate school and get involved with the Center for Independent Living. And so I was getting the Jewish Weekly. And in the Jewish Weekly, they had a dating service. And the dating service had two questions. One, do you have a disability? The other, would you consider dating someone with a disability? So I answered both of those affirmatively. And then I filled out the forms. And you're supposed to get like 3 to 5 names in like 3 to 4 weeks. And it was in June. And I kind of forgot about it. And in the summer, I went to Israel with the American Association, with AAAS, on a speaking tour with a number of other disabled people in science. I was in public health, and was away for 6 weeks, came back, and a week or two later, I see an envelope that came from the Jewish Weekly. And I'm like, oh yeah, I remember you filled this out. I opened it up, and you paid $36 for the service, and the check falls on the floor. And the letter says they found no one in their pool to meet my areas of interest. And if they ever did, they would get in touch with me. Well, needless to say, they never did. So I tell this story because I think it's a fundamental issue. While things have gotten better, I still think that because, as Trevor Noah said in the interview I did with him, when he used the word able-bodied, and I said, I don't use the word able-bodied, I use the word non-disabled because I have abilities just like you do. And you're going to get a disability at one point in your life, either temporarily or permanently. And he said, are you threatening me? And I remember being like surprised for a second. And then I thought, this is absolutely the right word. I wasn't offended by it. None of this stuff is rehearsed. So it was a word that just came out of his mouth. But I do believe that people are threatened by disability. They're threatened by aging, and age for people who are becoming older, there are higher incidence rates of disability. And for people who are used to being completely independent or reasonably independent, the thought of needing assistance from other people or having someone that would be a provider of assistance is something that is very difficult for them to get. It's appropriate for people to play certain roles, mothers, fathers, raising kids, working with your parents when they're getting older, but it's still in many ways not an equivalent level. So I think laws like IDEA and 504 and ADA and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and many other pieces of legislation, really, as they slowly become implemented, and disabled people with all types of visible and invisible disabilities, and we'll speak about that for a second in a minute. I think as that's happening, people are beginning to realize that having a disability is really something which is normal, and that there is much that we can be doing in the area of policy practices that would enable people who may need various forms of assistance to be able to get it in a way that is more natural and normative. Things like personal assistance. Should people really need to be leaving their homes to go live in a nursing home, where what COVID showed us is that 230,000 people have died who lived in nursing homes or other restricted living arrangements? Whereas people would be able to stay in their homes if we were looking at issues of accessibility in new construction and renovations. And if we had policies and practices for things like personal assistance services, where we had real systems in place for people who needed supports to be able to get them and to be able to have them paid for so that workers are getting appropriate wages. I think these are all critical issues to enabling us to really, hold on. Hey, guys. To enabling disabled people really to become equal members of society. Disabled children going to school with non-disabled children is very important. The model of what was going on when I was growing up, where kids who had physical disabilities like myself couldn't walk up steps, it was automatically assumed that you would go into these segregated classes. And in going into these segregated programs, it meant that other kids and adults looked at you differently. I had a mother who told me when I was visiting a school in Massachusetts when I was working in the Clinton administration, her kids were in a school where the disabled and non-disabled kids were being integrated on a regular basis, regardless of the significance of their disabilities. And she said to me, I will never allow my children to go to a school again where the disabled kids are separate, because they didn't see those children as being their peers. If they decided they would go and help out in a classroom, it was a good deed, as opposed to having, students who were their colleagues. And I think that's true regardless of the age. More disabled people working in the workforce, living in the communities, synagogues and other religious institutions that are making themselves accessible, an increasing number of rabbis with disabilities who both can discuss their personal experiences as disabled individuals, but are equal members within the Jewish community and are learned and really can help analyze some of the historic issues within the religion relating to disability. I think these are all very important things that really are slowly beginning to make some meaningful changes.
Right. Thanks. There's so much to unpack in what you just shared, Judy. And I want to go back to what you were saying about COVID, because COVID was a game changer in so many ways, complicated, nuanced ways for people living with disabilities and people living with invisible disabilities, people living with all kinds of disabilities. And now as we exit, or the restrictions, the COVID restrictions are loosening, we're seeing that some of the things that were put into place really as a matter of necessity during COVID, but that allowed people with disabilities greater access are being taken away. So the JCRC recently signed on to a letter that over 200 nonprofit organizations in Maryland signed on to, asking the Maryland Senate to reconsider having its decision to remove virtual testimony completely. And one of the arguments about that is that inadvertently, necessity is the mother of invention. The introduction of virtual testimony allowed more people who typically have difficulty accessing the halls of government to actually participate and engage with our democracy. On the other hand, I read an interview that you did within the last couple of weeks where you said some of this is a double-edged sword. And I think you alluded to that in what you were just saying about the importance of fully integrating people with disabilities into the natural stream of life. And I feel like we're at a critical juncture point as now we're exiting from COVID. So can you speak to that and about the public policy ramifications where you think we should be going?
I mean, I think it's very important that we not look at a one size fits all. And so in the situation that you're discussing right now about being able to testify, I think it is really important for many reasons that people be able to testify, not physically being on site. There are many reasons. I would say that you don't want it to only be that way. And, depending on the testimony, in many cases, there are people that are selected to testify. I wouldn't want someone who could be a really good representative of things like living in nursing homes and the problems of nursing homes, who might not be able to get there to testify, being excluded, or when there's just general comment period that people should be able to make comments and not necessarily have to be there. Likewise, I think in the area, for me, one of the things that's happened as a result of COVID is virtual presentations have really double and triple the number of presentations that I'm doing. And it's not just me, there are many other people. So I think we need to be flexible. I definitely do not want people to think that if you have a disability, all you want to do is be virtual. You don't want to go into work. You don't want to do any of these things, because that's totally not true. But for some people, that may be what they need to be able to work. Maybe some days going in and not all, especially given the fact that we still don't know everything about what's going to be going on with COVID. And for people who have immunodeficiencies, that might be something that they need to do in order to, maintain their health and be productive at the same time. So I think we need to be thoughtful. We need to really, as we are reopening, recognize the implications of the shutdown also. People, I haven't mentioned this specifically yet, but when we look at disability, many people have invisible disabilities. And I think certainly what we've seen with COVID is that more people have anxiety and depression than before, in part because of isolation. So we're really needing to provide appropriate supports for people, and also to continue to be opening up as we are, being respectful of everyone. I want to also say that, many people don't understand what the definition of disability is. So it's having a substantial condition which limits one or more major life activities, near physical and mental disabilities. It's very broad. It was intended to be very broad. And one of the adverse outcomes of people feeling ashamed of their disabilities is that they're afraid to disclose. They're afraid to disclose in their communities. They're afraid to disclose in their work site, which may mean that accommodations that someone might need, which most accommodations cost very little money, if any. But if people are afraid to disclose their disabilities, as I hear all the time, they're afraid they're not going to get the job. They're afraid they're not going to get promoted in the job. They're afraid they'll adversely be affected at the university in their studies if they disclose even things like low vision, so that people will really be making it much more difficult for themselves because they're afraid of asking for accommodations that might make life easier. So we have to really, when looking at disability, understand its breadth, that it's not just people who are blind and low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, have physical disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, but disabilities like diabetes and lupus and cancer, and many, many others. These are all legitimate disabilities. And even if an individual doesn't need an accommodation, the ability to bring their whole selves forward is really important. Certain disabilities come out more when you're older. And so again, another reason to allow people to feel comfortable if they are acquiring a disability, memory loss as an example, which is happening to people, and we need to have a better understanding of what it means and how we keep people connected in the communities. So I think from a Jewish perspective, we really have an obligation to delve much more deeply, to look at the work that we're doing as being part of the civil rights movement, which is from where I think the disability community really has grown, learning from others. And the role of the Jewish community in the civil rights movement is something that was very important to me in the 50s and 60s, as I was becoming old enough to recognize that what was happening to me and others was, while many people didn't want to use the word discrimination, I remember my parents saying, well, they didn't mean it. They didn't know any better. So now more people know better, they've learned more, and we have to make sure that they consider discrimination against disabled people of all races and creeds to be equally heinous based on disability.
So that brings to mind an issue that I think has really become even more patent during the COVID pandemic, which is the whole concept of intersectionality. So for example, the JCRC, we are active members of the Black and Brown Coalition for Academic Excellence and Equity related to Montgomery County schools. And there has been so much talk about academic loss of among disadvantaged students. And I guess one thing that has really struck me is the seeming bifurcation that the advocacy for children living with disabilities, whether invisible, visible, whether they're on the autistic spectrum, whether they have cerebral palsy or whatever, is kind of separated off from the rest of the advocacy that's occurring. Can you talk a little bit about that intersectionality and about, especially given the fact that I agree, I think people define disability too narrowly. And if you really look across the board, every demographic has a certain percentage of its population, adult or children, who will or currently have a disability. Can you talk about your experiences in dealing with that intersectionality?
I think intersectionality is very important. More and more people are looking at it separately from having disability being one of the parts of who you are. So I think I started doing the human perspective a number of years ago. And two of the first people that I had on to speak, one was a gentleman who was gay and in foster care and had cerebral palsy. And he made this comment that he wants to be able to bring his whole self to the table, and that his not being able to bring his whole self to the table adversely affects his life. And I define myself as a Jewish disabled woman, or a disabled woman who's Jewish, or a woman with a disability who's Jewish. And all three components are who I am. And for me, being able to enter the Jewish door, the Jewish women's door, the women's door, the disability door with the other components is very important. And I have to say that still frequently going through the door of disability is one where I feel pretty comfortable. Going through the door that's only women or only Jewish or Jewish women is not as comfortable, because I still feel that people don't necessarily feel natural about including people in the discussions, in the activities, in the events. Disability is still not woven enough, but again, I think these kinds of discussions and more disabled people becoming integrated and more disabled people being in jobs, and in the religious community, more leaders within the religious institutions, the federations, etc., allows for better discussion. I have to say that one thing that I've been hearing from a number of my friends with disabilities who are working in Jewish organizations around the country, and I'm hearing it from a number of people, is that they don't feel that they're being taken seriously, that they're not being really allowed to address within their organizations issues that Jewish disabled people feel are important. And people are looking at other jobs because, they've got enough experience now. They want to engage, but there's only so long they're going to be willing to engage if they feel that their issues aren't being taken seriously. So, when we look at intersectionality in the area of Judaism, it does also mean that we have to be serious and listen, just like we're listening to people of color and people from the LGBTQ community, or we're beginning to hear about what enables people to feel welcome or alienated. It's the same thing in the area of disability. And we also need to understand that there are disabled Jews of color, from the LGBTQ community. Addis Israel recently made, I think, an important change. The task force on disability, which started, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, is now being moved under the Social Action Committee. And Rabbi Tuckman is the one in charge of the disability working group. And I think all of this is really exciting, because part of what we've been saying is social action working groups that deal with things like homelessness or violence against women or whatever it may be. There are definitely disabled people in those communities, and you can't really look, for example, at the issue of homelessness and not understand how disability intersects with that. So I think these gradual changes are happening.
And that's Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, who actually spoke at the JCRC annual meeting last year, who is blind and is a phenomenal rabbi. And I'm reminded again of an instance just in the last year or year and a half where Rabbi Tuckman was the keynote speaker, and there was a headline that said "Blind Rabbi Speaks," not even her name, it was kind of so neutralizing. It was really just dehumanizing in some ways, which
was very, you would never introduce a rabbi without their name.
Right.
So the fact that, and I'm sure it's unintentional. One of the questions that we have is to please define intersectionality. So for me, intersectionality is a little of what we've been discussing, which is we are made up of different components, right? We may be Jewish from Ukraine, and that will bring something up now that might not normally be coming up, but it's a part of who we are, who we were, and we want people to recognize it. As Jewish women, we have over the years certainly been speaking up about the role of Jewish women and changing the role of Jewish women, because being Jewish and being a woman coming together is very important. I don't know, Gila, how would you answer that question of what intersectionality is?
Well, we get asked that all the time. And I think really it boils down to people bringing their whole selves to the table. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what intersectionality is. And it winds up, and I think because Jewish people struggle with it so much in terms of understanding, they wind up not being able to articulate and advocate for their own whole selves to be brought to the table, whether they have a disability, if they're sitting in a Jewish space and want to speak out about that, or whether it's an LGBTQ person on a campus who also is Jewish and who is Zionist. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what that means. But I agree with you that what it really means is that we are multifaceted individuals, and that we need to honor that and be able to feel comfortable bringing that to the fore, all of those pieces. And that when one of those pieces is really not honored and lifted up and recognized in the way that the others are, it leaves that person feeling diminished, very, very diminished. And which is exactly what you're talking about in terms of the doors and going through the different doors. I want to get to some more of the questions. And one of the questions was, where has the ADA succeeded? And where do you think it has fallen short? And if there are any areas in which it has fallen short, I'm going to add on to this, what can be done about it?
I mean, I think the ADA has been a very important piece of legislation. It doesn't cover everything, but in this climate, I would say thinking about the ADA as being amended to make it stronger would not be the right time. The Congress is such that it could potentially weaken the law that we have while we would try to make it stronger. I feel we need to be ensuring that disabled people and others really understand more clearly what the ADA is, because it's a law now that's 32 years old. And many people may know the name Americans with Disabilities Act or ADA, but many of them do not really understand what it means, who is protected, what rights you have to be able to file a complaint, for example, if you believe you've been discriminated against. And I link 5 for not just to protect the rights of people, but I think also to allow others to understand what the law means and what responsibilities they have to make sure that they are not violating the law. So there are other areas that we need more and better legislation, I would say, in areas like the Biden administration has in Build Back Better. Home and community-based services is one particular area. But even the language in the laws about, reconstruction, bridges, sidewalks, all those things will be beneficial. Enforcement is obviously always an issue if there's insufficient funding that the agencies have to appropriately enforce the law. I would say laws like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is not enforced effectively enough. I think the federal government needs to be doing more. And I say this based on my 7 years experience running the agency's program. So all those things need to continue to happen. Parents need to be much more informed about what their rights are so that they can be getting appropriate supports for their children in school, because too many parents do not understand what their rights are. And if they do, some school districts are right up front doing the right thing, others are not. And it's more difficult for an individual family to address these issues that may be systemic So the federal government and the role that it plays with state government to get them to enforce the laws, I think those are all very important parts. Someone here asked the question of what role do you think advancing technology can or will be able to play in helping people with disabilities? I think it's a great question. And it's a question also that we can be asking ourselves if we work in organizations. What are we doing to ensure that our websites and that the tools that we're using are accessible? Are we reaching out to people who are knowledgeable about accessibility to make sure that we are up to date with what is happening as far as technology that's available? I think we also, technology obviously is playing a more important role every day in our lives. And if you are not being able to participate because the technology isn't accessible, that has a very strong adverse effect on the individual who has a disability. But I want to also say that things like AI, artificial intelligence, is something that people are also very concerned about. Questions that are being developed when people apply for jobs that could be weeding people out who have various forms of disabilities because they don't answer the questions the correct way. There's a group called the American Association of People with Disabilities, which is based here in Washington, D.C. They're a great organization. In full disclosure, I'm on their board. Accessibility and technology is one area that they've been doing a lot of work on, as well as mentorship programs, summer internship programs, and a great deal of work on the Hill.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I was intrigued by Jim Sinclair. Jim writes, the fire marshal's office in my county told me recently that the fire code requires wheelchair users to be separated from their wheelchairs in places of public accommodations so the wheelchairs don't block egress aisles. What can be done to change things so the fire code requires egress aisles to be wide enough not to be blocked by wheelchairs, and so disabled people have the right to keep needed assistive equipment with them in all public spaces? So first, Jim, I would go back and tell the fire marshal's office that they're wrong. And maybe the very first thing you need to do is to call the Department of Justice. Go to ada.gov. They have a hotline. I'm laughing about this. I will tell you another quick story. In the 1980s, before the ADA, I was living in California still, and there was a movie theater that was telling wheelchair users that we couldn't stay in our wheelchairs. We had to get out of our wheelchairs. And of course, we were not going to do that because, as you mentioned in your question, it's not safe. If someone lifts me out of my wheelchair and puts me on a chair, and then there is a fire or something where you need to leave, I don't have my wheelchair and may not be able to get it back. So we took, I think 3 of us went there, 2 or 3 of us went in wheelchairs, and we brought a number of non-disabled friends who we had sitting in different parts of the theater. And we went to buy our tickets, and they weren't going to sell us our tickets. They said they were going to call the fire marshal. So we said, well, sell us the tickets, which they did, and go ahead and call the fire marshal. This is in Oakland, California. So the fire marshal came, and our friends around the theater started going, shh, shh, because they were interrupting the theater. And we gave them our cards, and we said, please feel free to call us. We all worked at the Center for Independent Living. And the next couple of days, the theater owner took out some seats. So, you know, there is actually a requirement about what theaters need to be doing. If they've been built after 1990, or if they've been renovated after 1990, they need to make sure there's appropriate seating. And even if they haven't, they can take a couple chairs out and have wheelchair seating. So the issue of blocking the exit to a building should not be a problem.
We have time for 2 more questions that were in the chat. So I'm going to actually put these 2 together. And then Judy, maybe you can address both of them. The first one has to do with restrictions on voting rights that are occurring at the state level, and the potential negative impact on people with disabilities and what can be done. I can tell you that in the state of Maryland, JCRC has supported for 2 years legislation that would actually enhance access for people living with disabilities to voting and provide greater accommodations. But we know this is a trend. So that's the first question. And the second question was about caregivers and protecting caregivers and providing better rights and protections for caregivers, especially women who we know shoulder the brunt of caregiving in the United States, especially given lack of nationalized healthcare and insufficient benefits for in-home personal assistance. If you could address both of those questions.
And let's separate them.
Yes.
Let's look at the voting first. I would say again, the American Association of People with Disabilities has a program called Rev Up, R-E-V as in Victor Up. They're a great program to reach out to. They're doing a lot of work in states in a bipartisan way to enable disabled people both to register to vote, to understand what their rights are under the law, and they have Rev Up affiliates in many states. They're also, very connected to civil rights organizations that are doing work in the area of voting rights and are working very hard on trying to get a federal piece of legislation passed, which would enable voting to be brought back to the position that it was previously, where voting was not something that we were using as a weapon to keep people away from being able to vote. So there's a lot of good work going on in there and in that area. And I think definitely if this is an issue that the JCRC is working on, I don't know if you're already working with American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD, but if not, it would be a really great organization to work with. I'm happy to make introductions. The other question was around
Caregivers.
personal assistants. I don't use the word caregivers. I use the word personal assistants. And I think I mentioned this a little earlier, and that is the need to be able to have appropriate funds available at the federal and state levels to be able to pay for personal assistance so that workers are getting an appropriate wage and healthcare benefits. Obviously, if we had national health, they would have healthcare benefits, but we don't. So right now, if the Build Back Better provisions on home and community-based services were to be passed, it addresses people who are on Medicaid, which is obviously very important. And one of the objectives of the Build Back Better home and community-based services provisions is to get rid of the waiting lists. And at the 140 billion level, that is still being looked at versus 450 billion, which was originally being looked at. You can see even if that comes through, it won't get rid of all the waiting lists. But additionally, for people like myself who have worked and are not Medicaid eligible from an income perspective, you're able to deduct a certain percentage of your personal assistance services off of your income tax, but it's not a system. And so I think, as I mentioned earlier, we really need to talk about the role that personal assistance service plays in our lives, the value of the workers, the need for the workers to be respected and to be able to get appropriate wages and benefits, And likewise for the individual person like myself and my husband, to be able to find people that we feel comfortable working in our home and assisting us. So it's really a win-win situation if we can get the whole issue of personal assistant service workers elevated. I find it really shocking that we don't like to discuss as a society things like going to the bathroom. People who have personal assistant needs and, need more significant assistance like myself, people don't want to discuss it. But it's reality of life. Everybody goes to the bathroom multiple times a day. And if you can't, that's a big problem. And so we're looking for people who are able to provide a broad range of services to a broad population of people. And they should be highly regarded for the work that they're doing, because they are providing an essential service that really strengthens our communities, keeps people living in the community, able to work and participate in society. And they should be valued, and that value should also include salary and benefits.
I will say that I couldn't agree more. The last 20 years of my parents' lives, they required personal assistance around the clock in their home. They never left New York. We were told, don't ever leave New York because it is the best state for in-home personal care. And even with that, we were constantly worried about inadvertently running afoul of the Medicaid regs and having those benefits removed. It is not a great way to live. And I know that the state of Maryland has a very, very long waiting list for waivers. There was just an article in the Washington Post last week about a gentleman who is being told that he needs to go into a skilled nursing facility because he has spent down his assets, and the state will not allow him to stay in his own home. And this is a vibrant person who should be working and who should be, out in the world and living independently.
But it is an issue that we in the community need to have a much better understanding about, because it adversely affects our whole community.
It does, and also the situation with people who work in home health care and work as personal assistants, and the lack of benefits and the lack of rights. These people carried so much of our society during COVID. They didn't stop going to work. And we really owe them the respect that they deserve for the work that they do. So we are coming up on time. Judy, I don't know if you have any final thoughts that you want to share.
No, I think everyone should go away from this discussion thinking about whether there was anything that you learned, anything you want to reflect on, where you could be doing something different in your life, in the organizations you work in the Jewish community or whatever. I hope that if you haven't seen Crip Camp, you see it. And if you haven't read Being Human or Rolling Warrior for your kids or grandkids, that you consider it.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was actually just going to say, for a start, watching Crip Camp or reading your wonderful book is a tikkun, is a wonderful way of bringing healing and correction to what has not been working in pursuing justice for all people in society, which is certainly such a cornerstone Jewish value. Judy, I can't thank you enough for spending this time with us this morning. And
Can I just say one other thing? Sorry. Yeah. Couple of people have written here about family members as caregivers. I completely agree with you. It's another perfect example of how family members are expected to be able to provide services for older family members, or for their kids who are now of an age where if they didn't have a disability, they would be doing things more independently. are not getting paid for their services and are very stressed as a result of it. I completely agree, and it's part of the broader discussion. And I think the Jewish community needs to be weighing in stronger.
Thank you, Judy. It's so true. And again, falls disproportionately on women. So there we go back to that intersectionality, which is what we were talking about before. Judy, thank you so, so much. If you haven't read Judy's book, if you haven't seen Crip Camp, please do. And thank you again. And we thank all of you for joining us. And this will be recorded. It will be available on the JCRC YouTube channel. So for anyone who had missed it, please share with them that it will be available. And I wish you all a wonderful Monday.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gila.